Welcome to the Category A Fraud Risk webinar. I'm Michael Mahan with FEMA's Public Assistance Training and Development Branch. The program agenda begins with a brief overview of the OCSO fraud risk profile that highlights the potential risk for fraud found in Category A. Next, we learn how important proper procurement practices are to avoiding potential fraud risk. Our presenter, John Griego, will walk through the key requirements of procurement involved. An overview of field operations follows, which highlights several important elements of the debris removal process intended to increase your awareness of potential opportunities for fraud. This section is followed by project verification, with an overview of documentation essentials. Our presenter, Russell Tandro, will guide us through the important nuances of these two key elements of fraud risk reduction. The objective of today's presentation is to help field staff better understand and identify these risk factors by proactively considering the indicators or flags that often lead to them. The major areas to be covered you see on the slide, but we'll also highlight leveraging FEMA-wide processes, procedures, and tools to enable all levels of the organization to identify and prioritize risk to fend off fraud. With the overview of the highest observed fraud risk, we'll touch on potential red flags such as bid rigging, bid suppression, complementary bidding, bidding rotations, schemes, and debarred, suspended, or ineligible contractors. The Office of the Chief Security Officer, OCSO, is organized into 5 separate divisions. One of these is the Fraud Investigation and Inspections Division. This division uses a multi-pronged approach to identify, prevent, and mitigate fraud, waste, and abuse of funds in all of FEMA's programs and operations, and investigates external allegations of fraud. The division works to detect, prevent, mitigate, and recoup fraudulent losses of federal funds and/or assets through fraud awareness and prevention training, data analytical research, investigations, and maintaining a proactive partnership with the DHS Office of Inspector General, pursuant to DHS or FEMA regulation or policy. The Program Review and Inspections Branch, PRIB, performed the investigation and created the fraud risk profile discussed here. This process began over 2 years ago when the OCSO initiated the fraud risk program overview of HQ PA Cat A. The investigation included interviews and 3 technical review sprints. These sprints, or interim reports, were reviewed, discussed, and responded to by a review team. The process resulted in the fraud risk profile discussed here. The report identified 5 major sections, including 1 best practice and 21 recommendations to prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. This overview will focus on the recommendations for 5 areas of the report and include: Headquarters Public Assistance can do more to proactively monitor regions to ensure compliance with policy and procedures of debris removal. Without HQ risk control procedures, including direct oversight monitoring, there exists a higher risk of fraud, misallocation of federal funds, and/or impropriety. Next, Headquarters Public Assistance oversight should ensure control measures are in place to validate debris removal monitors are properly operating under FEMA policy and procedures. Next, Headquarters Public Assistance can do more to provide strict monitoring over required documentation, which can allow fraud, waste, and abuse to occur. Failure to follow the required PA monitoring procedures can cause risk control measures failure. Next, a possible trend has been identified when a load ticket was either incomplete or absent. The validation cost summary report was also incomplete. This gives rise to the proposition: if failure occurs in an earlier phase and is not detected, it allows and perpetuates failure in all following phases. The report concludes a 33% failure of the risk control measure in the sample taken. Next, VAGO conducts quarterly process testing to validate completeness and compliance. This is a valid control measure. Based on the VAGO spreadsheet for fiscal year 18 final results and completed risk, the report concludes that this is a best practice. Let's summarize the first recommendation: implementing increased monitoring and oversight. FEMA requires applicants to monitor debris operations to ensure that the quantities and work claimed are accurate and eligible, and provides training to applicant debris monitors upon request. FEMA's debris monitoring guide includes specific guidance on debris monitoring activities to include roles and responsibilities, contracting guidance, and guidance on documenting eligible costs. In disasters with significant debris, i.e. 200,000 cubic yards or greater, FEMA also provides technical advice and monitoring through mission assignments. This slide summarizes the second and third major sections, documentation and validation. The PA Program and Policy Guide, PA-PPG, defines PA policy and procedural requirements, and Chapter 7, Emergency Work Eligibility, provides a list of documentation needed to support debris removal activities. In 2020, FEMA developed Streamlined Project Applications, or SPA, to simplify the applicant experience in navigating the PA process. The SPA Reference Guide for Debris Removal provides applicants with step-by-step instructions on completing a streamlined project application for Category A funding, including identifying all information and documentation required for project approval. PA is currently revising the program's information collection forms, including those for Category A debris removal, to standardize the information and documentation requested and tailor information and documentation requirements and processes to the underlying risk. Documentation will be touched on in greater detail later in the program. This recommendation calls for an increase in oversight by HQ to ensure the process is completed and all documents provided in Grants Portal and Grants Manager. However, the desired approach departs from the recommendation and instead places emphasis on the shared responsibility currently in place and how this broader effort is most effective. What is VAGO? VAGO, or Validate As You Go, is FEMA's public assistance grants payment internal control review process, which ensures FEMA's compliance with statutory and proper payment review and reporting requirements while significantly reducing project closeout documentation requirements for recipients, demonstrating effective internal control processes. Recipients who achieve and maintain low error rates, less than 1.5%, will be eligible for simplified closeout. The VAGO initiative is intended to enable FEMA to consistently assess payment error rates, identify and mitigate issues early, eliminate duplicative review, and significantly reduce the PA closeout grant burden on applicants. As previously envisioned, the documentation required for VAGO is different from that required for PA grant obligation and/or closeout of PA grants. Potential risk factors. The objective of today's presentation is to help field staff better understand and identify these risk factors by proactively considering the indicators or flags that often lead to them. The major areas to be covered you see on the slide, but we'll also highlight leveraging FEMA-wide processes, procedures, and tools to enable all levels of the organization to identify and prioritize risk to fend off fraud.
In this next section, we will go over the overview of the federal procurement rules. To ensure reasonable costs and eligibility for reimbursement consistent with applicable federal, state, local regulations, and to avoid fraud risks, the next two slides will briefly discuss risk factors and compliance actions. Procurement: how was the contract procured, pre-event or emergency? Consult with leadership to determine if contracts should be sent to PDAT, or the Procurement Disaster Assistance Team, for review. PDAT reviews contracts that are high dollar amount, sensitive, or high visibility. Additionally, PDAT can provide virtual or on-site training for applicant and SLTT partners. Very important that we get in front of potential contracts issues as soon as possible. A background on federal procurement under grants regulations. In the Code of Federal Regulations, Title II, Section 200, which covers the federal regulations that govern federal awards, including grants, the subsection of 2 CFR, Sections 200.317 through 327, are the 11 rules that govern procurement under federal grants. If a FEMA grant recipient or subrecipient does not have the labor force or expertise in-house to carry out work, they will often use contractors. When using federal grant funds to pay for the contract, grant recipients and subrecipients must comply with the federal procurement under grants regulations. Failure to follow these regulations when purchasing goods and services puts recipients and subrecipients at risk of not receiving full reimbursement for associated grant-related costs. The main purpose of these rules is to ensure a reasonable cost for contracts. This is important because the funds are coming from a public source. These procurement regulations are also in place to promote additional policy goals like encouraging the participation of diverse businesses in Rules 321 or purchasing certain goods with the United States in Rule 322. Rules that apply to states. A state entity is defined at 2 CFR Section 200.1 as any of the 50 states of the United States, the District of Columbia, any of the 5 territories of the United States, along with agencies or instrumentalities of that state or territory. State entities must follow these federal procurement regulations. Rule 317, following the same policies and procedures they use for procurements from their non-federal funds. This means that whenever procurement policies state entities follow when purchasing using non-federal funds are the same policies they will continue to follow when they are using FEMA grant funds. Rule 321, taking and documenting the 6 affirmative steps of socioeconomic contracting. Rule 322, applying a domestic preference for the procurement of certain goods. Rule 323, complying with guidelines on the use of recovered and recycled materials. And finally, Rule 327, including all necessary contract provisions. So to recap, state entities are primarily following their own state procurement policies and procedures in addition to 4 additional federal rules. Please make sure to check out the state entity fact sheet for more information about state entity procurement. Rules that apply to non-state entities. A non-state entity is any eligible FEMA grant recipient or subrecipient that does not meet the state definition. This includes local governments, such as cities, counties, and parishes, tribal governments, some hospitals, some institutions of higher education, and other nonprofit organizations, such as houses of worship or food banks. Non-state entities must follow their own procurement policies and procedures, which reflect applicable state or tribal law, and ensure all procurements comply with the federal procurement regulations at 2 CFR sections 200.318 through 327. If there is a difference between the non-state entities' rules and the federal standards, non-state entities must follow the rule that allows for compliance at all levels of governance. In some cases, this may mean the most restrictive rule. Now we will discuss the 5 key procurement requirements and how they prevent non-compliance. Number 1, have comprehensive documented policies and procedures. Both state and non-state entities should have written procurement policies and procedures that govern procurement transactions. Non-state entity procurement policy must prohibit conflicts of interest and the acceptance of gifts, ensure oversight is provided to contractors to ensure they are performing according to the terms and conditions of the contract, avoid acquisition of unnecessary or duplicative items, ensure that only responsible contractors are selected and they have not been suspended or debarred. And finally, identify how records will be maintained. Number 2, ensure full and open competition when awarding contracts. Full and open competition means that all responsible contractors are permitted to submit a sealed bid or proposal in response to the solicitation. It also means complying with the procedures for the informal methods of procurement. There are many benefits to full and open competition, some of which include increasing the probability of receiving the lowest, most effective cost option from the most qualified contractor, helps prevent favoritism, collusion, fraud, waste, and abuse, as well as allowing the opportunity for target firms such as small and minority-owned firms, women's business enterprises, and labor surplus area firms to participate in federally funded work. Non-state entities must ensure that their solicitation documents include a clear and accurate description of the goods or services being purchased. However, these descriptions must not unduly restrict competition. Awarding a sole source or non-competitive contract is only allowed under a limited number of circumstances, one of those being during public exigency or emergency circumstances. These are situations that demand urgent action to prevent or alleviate serious harm. If awarding a sole source contract due to emergency or exigency, it is important for the non-state entity to only use the contract during the actual period of emergency or exigency, and to provide written justification documenting their need to use a sole source contract. Number 3, it is important for non-state entities to document the cost of their contract is fair and reasonable. This is important because FEMA reimburses for eligible, reasonable expenses. For all procurements over $250,000, non-state entities are required to conduct a cost or price analysis after collecting bids or proposals. This analysis will help non-state entities compare the prices provided by prospective contractors with additional independent sources. A price analysis is the examination and evaluation of a proposed price without evaluating its separate cost elements and proposed profit. Techniques may include comparing offers with one another, comparing prior proposed prices with current proposed prices, comparing offers with competitive published prices, and comparing proposed prices with prices obtained through market research. On the other hand, a cost analysis is the review and evaluation of the separate cost elements, such as labor hours, overhead, materials, and proposed profit in a proposal to determine a fair and reasonable price for a contract. Failure to conduct a cost or price analysis is a common non-compliance finding by the Office of the Inspector General. It's important not only to do the analysis, but to also document that it was completed. This documentation is helpful evidence to FEMA that contract costs are fair and reasonable. Number 4, beware of risky contract types. Time and materials contracts, otherwise known as T&M contracts, is a cost reimbursement contract whose cost is comprised of direct labor hours charged as fixed hourly rates, plus the actual cost of materials. A T&M contract is riskier than a firm fixed price contract because the contractor can be inefficient with their time or resources and thus drive up costs of performance. Non-state entities can only use a T&M contract when it's not possible to estimate the extent or duration of the work, and only after determining and documenting there is not another suitable contract type. Additionally, non-state entities must ensure the contract includes a ceiling price that the contractor exceeds at their own risk. Oversight is provided to the contractor to avoid unnecessary cost overruns, and the contract is used only until the scope of work becomes clear. Once the scope of work becomes clear, a non-state entity must transition away from the use of a time and materials contract. Next is a cost plus a percentage of cost contract. This is another problematic contract type. A CPPC contract is a cost reimbursement contract containing some element that requires the recipient or subrecipient to pay the contractor an unknown amount based on a percentage of unknown future costs. This contract type is prohibited for the use by non-state entities because there is no incentive for a contractor to control costs, and the contractor can increase its profits by increasing costs of performance. How you can spot a CPPC contract: ask yourself these following 4 questions. Is payment at a predetermined percentage rate? Is this percentage rate applied to actual performance costs? Is the contractor's profit uncertain at the time of contracting? And does profit increase with an increased performance costs? Again, this contract type is prohibited by the use of non-state entities, even in periods of emergency or exigency. Any costs incurred under this contract type puts a non-state entity's FEMA award reimbursement at risk. Finally, number 5, include all federal required contract provisions. Both state and non-state entities are required to contain certain contract provisions. These provisions are described in Appendix 2 to Part 200. Contract provisions are required in order to protect the interests of the entity conducting the procurement as well as the federal government. There are 13 required contract provisions as well as 8 additional contract provisions that are recommended by FEMA. The applicability of the contract provisions depends on the type of work, the type of contract, the contract amount, the entity type, and the type of grant. Failure to include the required contract provisions is one of the most common findings of non-compliance for both state and non-state entities. Required contract provisions, such as the termination for cause and convenience, remedies, Bird Anti-Lobbying Act, and debarment and suspension clauses, are all important in helping prevent fraud. Please make sure to check out the Contract Provisions Guide for additional support when complying with this rule. Finally, we will discuss and go over some procurement resources to help your entities remain compliant with the federal procurement rules. For procurement under grant resources, please make sure to check out fema.gov/grant/procurement/resource library. Here you will find a number of great procurement resources to include the PDAT Field Manual, the Contract Provisions Guide, the Fraud Fact Sheet, Common Mistakes Fact Sheet, as well as other helpful fact sheets and checklists. Reporting fraud risk. There are multiple ways to report fraud or suspicious activity via telephone, email, or website. This information can also be found on PDAT's website. FEMA encourages recipients to provide subrecipients with this fraud reporting information in key trainings and guidance documents.
Field operations. How do you spot potential fraud risks in the field? Oversight. Regular observations by FEMA field staff of removal operations, monitoring our operations and debris management sites, and also a daily review of data and actual collection numbers versus the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers estimates. Field operations. These factors and associated indicators historically reflect significant risk patterns. Here are some key areas of responsibility. So for PA staff responsibility, we include to review the reports from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on any internal or outside debris task force and understand the cultural surroundings of the debris locations. For applicant SLTT partners, our state, local, tribe, and territory responsibilities, debris monitoring state applicant serves as one of the most important compliance requirements when utilizing contract labor and requires close coordination between the applicant, the contractors, and PA field staff to ensure compliance and minimize fraud. The Debris Removal Task Force, or DRTF. The overall complexity and disaster impacts may require establishing a task force to support the coordination of effective debris operations across the impacted area. The transition period from initial clearance activities to debris removal depends on the magnitude of the disaster impact. It's scalable, flexible, and adaptable to account for different incident levels and to assist leaderships in aligning key roles and responsibilities needed to manage complex debris removal operations. The Infrastructure Branch Director and PA group supervisor serves as the internal lead and delegates the management of the debris operations once the debris task force is established. The debris task force lead is the primary point or contact for the recipient applicant debris operations until a program delivery manager is assigned. The debris task force will work closely with the program delivery manager task force lead to provide program delivery managers on recipients' applicants' needs, critical activities, and any complex issues once the PDMG has been identified. The debris task force should coordinate with our SLTT partners on prioritizing debris operational needs. For example, identifying applicants with most significant debris impacts can assist with staff assignments or monitoring needs. Additionally, applicants identified with the minimal debris impacts may not require dedicated task force support. Ensure that our SLTT applicants understand debris monitoring is the responsibility of the local applicant government. FEMA may insist or provide training, but monitoring is the applicant's responsibility to ensure PA funding for debris claims is not jeopardized. We're going to look at some of the fraudulent examples in the next couple slides, including contractors building towers too low. What's the impact? Well, the monitor's line of sight in the truck body is limited. Without the full line of sight, the ability to detect cavities or other factors that may influence the percent estimated for the load. The monitor is unable to accurately make the load call. Bridging loads. Bridging loads is also crisscrossing trees and limbs to make it appear that the truck is more full than it actually is. This is one example when a line of sight is critical to reduce the risk of fraud. Remember, being paid by the load may incentivize the contract to attempt this deception. Expired permit tags on trucks. Ensuring the equipment is in use is properly registered and that the carrier capacity clearly identified is essential to determining the proper load call. Out-of-date or expired permit tags cast doubt on the actual load capacity, and it's a potential risk for fraud. Here we have some fraudulent examples. Bridge loads. This load is purposely bridged to make it seem like the truck is loaded full. The higher the load call, the more the hauler makes. This particular load was called at 75% full. As you can see in the photo, the truck is more like 20% full than 70% full. Here we see where the landfill towers are built too low. This makes it difficult for the tower monitor to see what's in the trucks. It also makes it very difficult to make accurate load calls. Low towers also make it difficult for tower monitors to check and make sure trucks have completely dumped their loads. Please note that this can happen at any size event. The images shown on these slides are from smaller disasters where the potential risk may seem lower. The recommendations of the report and the observed risk factors are not only weighed toward large events with extensive debris removal, but also with smaller events as well. The first photo shows an example of a low-built landfill tower. The second photo shows a truck that has not dumped its entire load. Therefore, FEMA will be paying for the same debris twice. False shelf. A false shelf can make it so the loaded truck looks full, but in actuality is only 20% full. Project verification. Note the title is verification rather than validation. At this point in the project phase, the process is verification. That base, please note that PDAT review contracts are high dollar amount, sensitive, or highly visible. Please consult with your leadership to determine if contracts should be sent to PDAT for review. B, specialty debris, leaning trees, hazardous limbs, and stumps. Good photos demonstrating immediate threat. Are the supporting documents provided applicable and responsible to the specific documentation needed? We also want to confirm temporary and final disposal sites are legitimate with appropriate permit numbers and EHP approval. Is the record in the desired format? Does it provide the detail required, or does it have to be filtered and sorted? We also have to make sure that there's proper coordination and adherence to protocols involving PPDR and any waterway debris removal operation. Verifying provided records are applicable and responsive, and the appropriate phase will support the CRC validation during the next phase. Contract reviews by PDAT. Has the applicant followed their own documented reviews, rules, and procedures? We have to make sure that the applicant is consistent with their own statutes, regulations, or policies. Number 2, competitive or non-competitive. Has the applicant provided an explanation why the non-competitive procurement was necessary? And then John talked earlier about contract types. We have to verify the type of contract. Is it a time and material contract? Is it a cost plus, pre-positioned, cooperative purchasing? We have to know what kind of contract type that is. Please note that PDAT may not be able to review every contract, as we generally review contracts that are high dollar amount, sensitive, or high visibility. We do have resources to assist FEMA staff with conducting contract compliance reviews. On September 6, 2022, the FEMA released the Simplifying Public Assistance Program Part 2. Basically, what has happened is FEMA is eliminating the size requirements for the eligibility of the removal of hazardous trees, limbs, and stumps. Size requirements for eligibility are eliminated as follows. Removal of hazardous trees, 6 inches or larger in diameter. 6 inches is no longer the desired amount. There is no size at this point. Removal of hazardous limbs. It used to be 2 inches in diameter. That is no longer the case. Removal of stumps, 24 inches in diameter. The stump still needs to be uprooted 50% to be eligible, but the 24 inches in diameter is no longer applicable. Documentation is still required. Only size requirements for eligibility have been eliminated. Confirmed temporary and final disposal sites are legitimate with appropriate permit numbers and EHP approval. Has the applicant provided this information? Does the recipient maintain a web page with the local information, permit numbers, GPS, etc., and to enable confirmation? It is important that the information is provided, otherwise the debris removal may not be in FEMA environmental historic preservation compliance. Project verification D. Proper coordination and adherence to protocols involving PPDR, non-commercial or commercial, and any waterway debris removal operation. Is the debris from the private property locations requested in the public interest? The determination must be made by the state, territory, tribe, county, or municipal government's public health authority or other public entity that has legal authority to decide that the disaster-generated debris on private property constitute an immediate threat to life, public health, or safety, or the economic recovery of the community at large. Debris removal and disposal from natural features or engineered facilities to eliminate immediate threat for navigable waterways. Debris removal eligibility is limited to a maximum depth of 2 feet below the low tide draft of the largest vessel that normally utilizes the waterway prior to the incident. For non-navigable waterways, debris removal is only eligible to the extent that it is necessary to eliminate an immediate threat. If the debris obstructs or could obstruct intake structures, could cause damage to the structures, or is causing or could cause flooding to improve property. The DHS Office of Inspector General hotline is used to report corruption, waste, fraud, abuse, mismanagement, and misconduct to the Department of Homeland Security Office of the Inspector General. The phone number and website is listed on the slide, as well as the address. This concludes our program. By sharing this brief overview of the OSCO fraud risk profile and highlighting the potential risk for fraud found in Category A, our goal is to increase awareness and the importance of proper procurement practices and key requirements, to identify the important elements and opportunities for fraud found in field operations, to increase understanding the significance of documentation to project verification, and the nuances of fraud risk reduction. We hope this presentation has succeeded in increasing your understanding and your ability to identify potential fraud risk factors and highlighted areas where the potential fraud is greatest. Remember to report corruption, waste, fraud, abuse, mismanagement, and misconduct to the Department of Homeland Security Office for the Inspector General. Thank you for your time.
If you are working with any documents used for a FEMA grant, you are responsible for safeguarding personally identifiable information, or PII. PII refers to anything that can be used to directly or indirectly identify an individual. Some examples of PII are names, addresses, social security numbers, and financial account information. This type of information must not be uploaded into Grants Portal or Grants Manager. To report corruption, waste, fraud, abuse, mismanagement, and/or misconduct, contact the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General by phone at 1-800-323-8603 or via the website or mailing address listed on the screen now. Procurement requirements are among the most complicated parts of the PA grant process, and noncompliance can result in deobligation of funding. Please make sure that you are following FEMA's procurement guidance for recipients and subrecipients. Federal requirements for procurement and contracting are described in 2 CFR Part 200. The Procurement Disaster Assistance Team, or PDAT, offers some training and tools on their website, www.fema.gov/grants/procurement. For technical assistance with Grants Portal or Grants Manager, you can call the PA Grants Portal Grants Manager hotline at 866-337-8448. National hours of operation are 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern, Monday through Friday. The hotline can also be reached by email at FEMA-recovery-PA-grants@fema.dhs.gov. We have many other recorded webinars and tutorial videos available on our YouTube channel. You can find them by searching for FEMA Grants Portal on YouTube or by navigating to the Support Center in Grants Portal or Grants Manager.
Thank you for watching.